my fear is that people will say, well, F it. If I'm here and I'm sacrificing and I'm suffering and so are my friends, why isn't everybody else? And that goes directly to fighting spirit. And eventually you win wars by killing the fighting spirit of your enemy.
Jonathan Conricus, former IDF spokesperson, combat commander, is a senior fellow these days with the FDD and a very popular speaker in Israel and abroad, for good reason, as State of Tel Aviv listeners know well by now. Today, he is also jet-lagged, but very feisty, pulling no punches when we get into a discussion of the continued and heightened refusal of ultra-Orthodox haredi Israelis to serve in the army. This last year has drained the human and financial resources of Israel, and the continued entitlements of the haredim, among them to shirk military service, is now becoming elevated to a national crisis. The main power blocks in the current government are Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party, the haredim, and the religious Zionists. The latter are devout. They also serve and work. They contribute significantly to the state, and members of their community are dying in combat in disproportionate numbers. Since Conricus and I spoke this morning, the religious Zionist party leader, who is also the Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, has announced that his party will no longer support daycare subsidies for Haredi families who refuse to serve in the army, unless, he allowed, if state allowances for reservists are increased. When Jonathan Conricus comments on the shameful conduct of this government that focuses so much effort on political shenanigans to maintain power in spite of the cost to citizens, metaphorically and literally, he is referring exactly to this kind of political drama that persists day in, day out, but is particularly distasteful at this time. Before drilling down into this topic, which preoccupies much of Israel these days, we speak of Iran's renewed threats to attack Israel again, and much more harshly this time. Should that transpire, the U.S. has warned that it will not be able to restrain Israel in its retaliation. Not this time. Iran has threatened to attack before the U.S. election in 2 days. We'll see. So, as we do so often these days in Israel, we wait. And we wait also for word of the hostages, who remain stuck in Hamas hell. And people wonder, quietly, if they will ever come home. That, the return of the hostages, should have been priority number one from day one of this war, in my view, because their continued captivity also corrodes the soul of this country. For some things, we cannot wait. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and looking hard for that silver lining every moment of every day. Stay with us. Good Sunday morning, Jonathan Conricus. A little jet-lagged, I understand.
But happy to be back in our home in Israel.
Even if only for a few days.
Even if only for a few days. It's always, the amount of things that happen in just one news cycle of a few hours or a day in Israel. It's quite amazing. You blink, you miss things.
Absolutely.
It's quite amazing. We're all kind of news junkies in the current environment, and it's fast-paced and it's ever-changing. And if you kind of zone out for a few hours, if you go to a Canadian lake or whatever, then you can miss important things. I mean, yesterday I didn't follow news for about half the day, jet lag and etc. And I missed the fact that the IDF nabbed a senior naval terrorist from Hezbollah in quite a daring raid about, I think it was 50 kilometers north of Beirut. So more than 100 kilometers away from Israeli borders. And you see that afterwards and you say, oh, well, that happened.
Yeah, that was quite spectacular. So I know that everyone who's going to be listening to this podcast is going to be obsessively, wildly focused on the U.S. elections, and rightly so. But we're going to hold off on discussing that today. And I'd like to focus on what is probably issue number one in Israel. And that is, again, the likelihood of yet another attack by Iran or its proxies on Israel. It's interesting because initially, Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, after Israel responded on October 26th to the Iranian attack of October 1st, initially Khamenei was saying, yeah, no big deal. They didn't do anything. Those Israelis, whatever. It's over. Trying to diminish or downplay. And then it seems that there was a shift, and either it took the Iranians a couple of days to actually assess the extent of the damage that Israel had caused to their military infrastructure, in particular their air defense systems, or a different faction within the ruling class prevailed. But what we do know is 2-3 days after the Israeli attack, the statements and rhetoric and bombast coming out of Iran changed from whatever to we're going to hit back, and we're going to hit that hard, and Israel has no idea what is going to be visited upon them, because this time it's going to be really bad. We know that in recent days, the U.S., I believe, has sent over 20 B-52 bombers. Those are big beasts. We know that an Israeli naval vessel is getting closer to Yemen, and it has the capability to launch ballistic missiles with a 400-kilometer range. We also know that there has been intelligence that's made it into the public sphere that the expectation this time is that even if Iran does attack Israel directly again, that they are revving up their proxies so that it may be a multi-front attack from Hezbollah, from the Houthis, if and whatever Hamas is capable of, and of course, Iran. And we're sitting here, and whatever it will be, of course, very interested in your thoughts and analysis on what may or may not be going on.
Right. So I think I agree with everything that you said, and it's a very succinct summary of what's been going on and the main moving parts. It is very interesting to see, and I would, it's quite mysterious, Iranian decision-making, because anybody who knows what Israel struck in Iran and the consequences for the Iranians as a result of what Israel struck, I think, the assessment would be that the Iranians would be wise to quiet down and try to find off-ramps to de-escalate the situation, because they are vulnerable. Their capital is vulnerable with all its facilities, headquarters, seats of government, economic installations, symbols, etc. And most other locations are also vulnerable because Israel took out all of the existing S-300 air defense batteries. And what Iran has left is slower moving, lower altitude, smaller range air defenses that are also questionable in terms of their quality and ability to deal with fourth generation and fifth generation attack aircrafts like the F-35s. Probably none of the systems that even Iran had could deal with them, but now probably not at all. So when I try to put myself in their shoes, I am a bit puzzled by their rhetoric and the fact that they insinuated through CNN that not only are they going to strike Israel again for a third time, but that they're going to do it before the elections. To which the Americans have responded, I think also on CNN, that, well, if you guys do, we won't be able to, and we're not going to guarantee that we'll be able to hold back those crazy Israelis again, of course, which insinuates that is what they did last time, and that is why Israel only struck military targets last time. And I think that there's more than a grain of truth to it. So where we currently stand is an interim period where the ball is in the Iranian court. In terms of assessing their military capabilities as an axis, I would say that they're not in a very good situation. Hamas is done militarily in terms of long-range and significant military capabilities, not relevant. Hezbollah is relevant. They have long-range capabilities, but they are far below what many people believed in Israel and in Lebanon their fighting capabilities would be if you'd asked the question a month and a half ago or 2 months ago. Had you asked me then, what is Hezbollah's all-out capability? I would have said high number of hundreds, maybe low number of thousands of rockets per day. And what we're seeing from Hezbollah is much below that. And that isn't because they've run out of motivation. It is because their command and control has been severed. It is because many of their commanders have been killed. It is because their logistics have been damaged. And it is because the IDF has struck preemptively a lot of their launch sites, which they probably thought would be safe and concealed and would be used as a surprise. And Israel kind of trumped that surprise and struck the launchers before Hezbollah was able to use them. The other Iranian proxies, militias in Iraq and in Syria, they still have rockets, missiles, and drones. They continue to fire drones, I would say, relentlessly at Israel. The last, I would say, week, we've seen substantial improvement in how the Israeli Air Force deals with drones. And it's like everything in war, it's a learning contest between two sides. Currently, it seems as if the Israeli Air Force has, through trial and error and a lot of effort, found out what doesn't work, which weapon systems do not work, and what works better. I can say that what Israel is doing now is a very resource-intense response, but one that is working. And Israel has been able to take down quite successfully 95% of the incoming drones in the last week and a half. And there's been more than 10 fired at Israel, and they've been intercepted. And that's, of course, after we had significant casualties, both military and civilian, from other drones. So when I summarize this, I would say the following. If the Iranians indeed decide to attack Israel again, I would be surprised because it doesn't make military sense. On the contrary, I would invite them to, because then that would pave the way for Israel to strike and to strike hard at various military, regime, and economic targets, and perhaps even nuclear ones, which I think would be very bad for Iran. Last point, you said we're not going to discuss the elections, but one point that is important when it comes to decisions in the Middle East is that I think the period referred to by many as the lame duck period between November 5th and January 20th is a period which I think will be very volatile. All sides, irrelevant of who wins in the US, Israel and Iran will have various incentives to escalate the situation. And I think that the period between November 5th and the beginning of January, we will see lots of interesting things happening for various political and military reasons. And I think that we're in for quite a challenging period. Currently, I am happy to see a lot of things that for many years, people at FDD and others in Israel said, well, this needs to happen. Israel needs to hold the Iranians accountable. Israel needs to be on the offensive. Israel needs to have a plan to help and support the Iranian people against the regime. Israel needs to threaten the regime and force it to stop having the ability and leisure and audacity to continue to attack Israel. Slowly that's happening, and I think that the coming weeks and months will be very interesting in the Chinese curse of the interpretation in that sense, as in violent and lots of things are going to happen.
As in, euphemistically put, we live in interesting times. I'd like to just briefly pick up on a few very important nuggets that you dropped in there. And one, which is very significant, of course, is the issue of deterrence. And what you're saying, I believe, is that in that lame duck period, not only will things be very volatile, but it will become very clear if Iran has been deterred by any military responses that have taken place already or that are yet to come. What we're seeing now in terms of the volatility is the previous Israeli response to Iran was intended to send a message. We can really hurt you. We can hit your oil refineries. We can even get to your nuclear sites. We can get to key sites of importance to the regime, both civilian and military, and infrastructure, especially now that we've knocked out your effective air defense systems. This is a message, Iran, back off. And what we're seeing now is that deterrence may not have actually been received. That message of deterrence may not have been received in the way we would have hoped. So again, we may see follow-up before the election. It may come in the lame duck period. But we in Israel more than have our hands full. And you mentioned one of the areas in which Israel has improved significantly in terms of defense is drones. And you also said that it's very resource intensive, but effective, that we are learning and becoming more effective. We also are now in Jabalia in the northern Gaza Strip, fighting a very intense battle that has been raging now, I think, for about 2 weeks, is fair to say. I believe this is the fourth time the IDF has gone into Jabalia. And the casualties, you and I both know, are very high, particularly for such a small country as Israel. Notwithstanding the fact that, as you point out, in the northern front, that in Lebanon, Hezbollah has been, their capability to fight has been reduced considerably more because of the disruption in their chain of command than the destruction of their missile and other weapon supplies. And we also know that our troops have taken a very heavy toll in fighting up there, and in particular, Miluim, reserve soldiers in their 40s and 50s. We're running out of resources. We have a crisis of resources here. And I'm wondering if you can comment on the current, and it's very much a domestic issue, but it's a really significant one. How is Israel going to deal with this strain on its human, every type of resource?
So all wars, I think, eventually are won by breaking your enemy's will to fight. For many years, I think Israel hasn't been really allowed to win a war and really to break our enemy's will to fight. I think the last time that Israel did so was in Yom Kippur, 1973. And even then, Israel, I think, was militarily capable of doing much more. But a Russian threat to use nuclear weapons and to get involved in the fighting on the Golan Heights was what saved the Syrian capital, and a similar thing 101 kilometers from Cairo and the encirclement of the Egyptian division in Sinai. Israel could have done more and could have done an even more decisive victory. We have not dealt any of our enemies a decisive blow. Now, how do you do that? You do it by inflicting enough pain and also bringing your enemy to the understanding that they've run out of options, resources, capabilities. And in this case, we're hitting our enemies quite hard, Hamas and Hezbollah. We're hitting their infrastructure, their logistics, and their resources. We're starting to do the same thing with Iran. But as you point out very correctly, we are a small country with very finite personnel, resources, and a small market. And the very sad thing is that most of the people who are fighting, and you mentioned 40 and 50-year-old reservists, but also the 20 and 30-year-old men, mostly men, but there are a few women also who are fighting. They are also amongst the most productive parts of Israeli society. They are the ones who are working. They are the ones who are generating revenue and paying taxes. They are the ones who actually keep this country running in many aspects. And we see that it kind of lands, that burden lands on the same people. And I don't know numbers enough in order to say something about, the calculations. But I will say that what I think eventually is my concern is the spirit and how much these reservists and regular troops will continue to be able to sustain, and how much they will feel that the entire country is behind them, and that their tremendous sacrifice, personal safety, their income, their families, all of the horrors of war, that is valued in the right sense by Israeli society and politically by the elected officials in Israel. That is my concern, and that is where I see the biggest threat. That is where I see the biggest attrition, because we are blessed with amazing, outstanding, patriotic, brave, professional men and women who are willing to give up the comforts of life and go and fight in order to defend their communities. Sadly, we see how many are wounded, and unfortunately are killed. These are really astronomical numbers that we're dealing with. We're close to 800 killed security personnel so far, and more than 10,000 wounded, which of course all will need long rehabilitation, and not all of them will need long rehabilitation. And I started with speaking about the will to fight, and that's how you defeat an enemy. In my mind, our real enemy is ourselves and our ability to retain and show to the people who are eventually paying the price and making the sacrifice, to their families and spouses, that yes, we value what you do, and yes, we as a country and as a society will prioritize supporting and recognizing that. And we are not. That is what I'm concerned with. I see what the current government is focusing on. I see the government continuing in what I have no other words than just to say shameful. A shameful political attempt to keep a coalition intact by legislating and legalizing exemption of duty. As so many Israelis are out on the battlefield, parts of Israeli society want to legalize their exemption from duty that everybody else is burdened by. And that is what this government is currently dealing with. And if anything worries me, it is the decision-making and the priorities of this current government, which in that specific topic, I think are horribly, horribly mistaken. And I would even say something as difficult as, I wouldn't say treason, but I would say that it is within the ballpark of those topics. And I think it is such a betrayal of the people who are fighting, of the reservists and the soldiers who are fighting on the battlefield, for them to see that what this government is doing is busy finding a way to wiggle around and to satisfy the demands of fringe and less productive parts of Israeli society, and to give them the kosher stamp that they want and the legal exemption from serving in the military or doing any kind of service to the state of Israel. I think that is reprehensible, and that is really the thing that worries me. Mm-hmm. Our enemies will be there the day after, and I think that the military achievements so far show that we have our enemies now more on the back foot. Some of them more, some of them there's still a lot to do. But bottom line, I think that what we need to do is to look inwards and to have our priorities straight.
So allow me to say explicitly what you put so elegantly, what you're talking about as a fringe and a population, a demographic that has significant power in the current political government leadership, and also comprises 15% of Israeli society today, is what we refer to in Israel as the haredim, the ultra-Orthodox. I think that it's very important to ensure that the listeners understand that the ultra-Orthodox are very different from the religious Zionists. And this government is composed of right-wing parties like Likud, and then the main blocks of power are the ultra-Orthodox haredim and the religious Zionists. But the religious Zionists are very religious, very observant. They serve in the army or in national service, the young women, and they work and support their families. The ultra-Orthodox and haredim do not.
Yeah, not only do an important point, sadly, not only do the religious people, kippah sruga, not only do they serve and work, but sadly, we've seen over the last few weeks how many of them make the ultimate sacrifice and sadly die on the battlefield. When you look at the places of where they come from, the last casualties in the IDF, many of them are from Judea and Samaria. Many of them would be what we would call kippah sruga, and from the nationalistic people in Israel, very patriotic and very committed. And they definitely, if not only pull their fair share of the wagon, but some would say that they do more. So this isn't, from my point of view, this isn't about who's religious. You can be religious, observant, you can study Torah and be a great Jewish scholar and fight and defend your country and be a proud patriot and citizen and pay your taxes. It can all live in one. And I think that many people in Israel are a beautiful example of exactly that. And then you have others who I would call freeloaders, who want not to be burdened by the same things. There's a tremendous untaxed economy, a black market that relies on cash and of unofficial jobs, which is again a tremendous loss of income for the country and revenue, which also corresponds with people who do not do military service. It's all part of the same thing. It's part of the growing fringes of Israeli society, Ultra-Orthodox, Haredim, and Arabs, people who feel that they're less part of the story, who contribute less to society, and who need to be brought into the fold, need to be educated, need to be embraced by other parts of Israeli society. But what their leadership is currently doing for political reasons of power is to continue to keep that divide existent and to exempt them from military service, understanding that service is the gateway to the civilian society, to eventually employment, legal employment, to paying taxes, and to being part of society as a whole. And there are very strong political powers in Israel who do not want to see that coming together, who want the silos up, who want people disenfranchised, poor, uneducated, and under their political control. And they work in order to do so. And that's why the last, I think, 5 or 6 Israeli governments, what eventually brought them down was, will or will they not serve? And it's important to say, last thing before I have to check out, is that currently the Israeli government, the military, and the Ministry of Defense are in violation of Israeli law. There is a law which is not being implemented, not by the IDF, not by the Ministry of Defense, and not by the Prime Minister, which says the exemptions from service are illegal. And the IDF must call on all 18-year-olds that are not very specific categories of students, of religious scholars. Everybody else should serve. And currently, they are not. And the military is basically trying to deal with the hot potato. And the government, of course, isn't doing anything useful about it. And at the end of the day, the Israeli establishment is in violation of Israeli law. After many exemptions and extending of the legislation and many deferrals have been made, now the whole system is in violation. And at the end of the day, how this matters, it matters because people care. I think that eventually my fear is that people will say, well, F it. If I'm here and I'm sacrificing and I'm suffering and so are my friends, why isn't everybody else? And that goes directly to fighting spirit. And eventually you win wars by killing the fighting spirit of your enemy.
Just to sew that up and put a bow on it, the interests in the Knesset that are fighting against this draft law that you say sits on the books and is not being adhered to are pushing right now, in the midst of all of the challenges that Israel faces, are pushing to have this exemption passed as legislation, enshrined, and causing lots of consternation and other problems here. But we'll have plenty of time in the future to get into that. Right now, thank you so much for your time, as always, and insights, and I suppose all eyes on America for the next few days, huh?
All eyes on America, a few eyes on Iran. Smaller things like UAVs and missiles and rockets and suicide bombers and all of the other things that unfortunately have become part of daily life in Israel. We'll continue to note and count them. But the big picture, yes, we'll be looking at America and Iran and preparing for another Iranian attack.
Enjoy the short time you have at home. Talk to you soon. Thank you. That's a wrap for today. Yaakov Katz will be back next Sunday. In the meantime, stay tuned for some amazing podcasts and articles coming up. If you're American, please vote. We're all watching anxiously. Follow State of Tel Aviv on Instagram at State of Tel Aviv, all one word, or on X at State of TLV, all one word. Thanks again for listening. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Szabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.